Previously on Angry Green Jellybean's YouTube channel.
Dates all the way back to Aristotle, who famously lost the race to be on a magic card to his precursor Socrates. Socratic dialogue. It's a method of developing ideas and often reaching consensus through the challenging of beliefs held by those involved in the conversation through lines of questioning. The concept was popularized in the writings of Plato and Xenophon, which often featured Socrates as the protagonist, presenting himself as a simple man. All I know is that I know nothing, a common answer when anyone asks me if I'm actually any good at magic, who serves to deliver a form of interrogation that ultimately leads those he converses with to see the flaws in their own assertions and reasoning. The most famous example is likely Plato's Republic, which single-handedly delayed this video when partway through writing this script I decided I likely needed to read it in order to have a fuller understanding of what I wanted to be the theme of this video in the end. And if you want to support this wannabe philosopher monarch, you can like and subscribe. Why am I telling you about this? Oh yeah, it is also the name of the ability found on Socrates' Athenian teacher, released in Universes Beyond Assassin's Creed. A 0/4 human advisor for Azorius and 1 with Defender, hexproof as long as it's untapped, and for the cost of tapping, Socratic dialogue gives target creature the ability, if this creature would deal combat damage to a player, prevent that damage. This creature's controller and that player each draw half that many cards, rounded down, until end of turn. To look at this from a flavor perspective, the Socratic dialogue challenges your initial assertion, your decision to attack, by preventing damage, and in turn grants each interlocutor knowledge, this being analogous with card draw as depicted on cards like Quick Study or Accumulated Knowledge. Socrates wasn't exactly a fighter, so him being a defender makes sense, and him having a form of protection when he has not engaged in his conversational abilities is a nice touch that could be seen to allude to his eventual execution after charges of impiety and corrupting the Athenian youth. Also, he had a big ass. Given the commitment to flavor present in the design of this card, when I decided to build a deck for Socrates, I wanted to also commit to flavor in a clear and consistent way, which is what led me to making the deck entirely creatureless, with the exception of Socrates himself, to really portray a guy just yapping a lot. Yes, there are plenty of creature synergies that would make for good avenues of deck building with Soc. You could create an infinite loop of combat damage prevention with Ireth of the Healing House and Marvin Murderous Mimic, using Socrates and Marvin to target 2 attacking creatures and prevent their damage, then untap them both using Ireth and then use Socrates again, then untap Ireth and Soc with Marvin, so on and so forth, which would probably be funny exactly once. He's an advisor, and so is Persistent Petitioners, a 1/3 human advisor for blue and 1 that you can pay 1 and tap to have target player mill a card, then tap 4 untapped advisors you control to have target player mill 12 cards, and of which you can have any number of copies in your deck. From there, you can include another advisor in Bruvak the Grandiloquent and double your mill. This is pretty straightforward and lets you run some typal staples, as well as cards that play nicely with any number of cards like Thrumming Stone to enhance the overall strategy. But ultimately, it's a bit on rails for my taste. This would also be a massive flavor fail because a petition is a formally written request, and Socrates was famously bad at writing things down. Hence, most of our present understanding of his philosophy comes from his students and contemporaries instead. You could make a giant shark with Shabraz, drain the table with Psychosis Crawler, or try to win with a Triskaidekaphile. There are a lot of creatures that care about card draw, but creating an army of fantastical creatures or weird little guys didn't feel like it fit for a singular thinker like Socrates. So I got to work on creating a deck that I thought would leverage Socrates' ability, have adequate protection against the pitfalls of a creatureless deck in terms of removal and control, and would maybe actually win a game. And it was boring. The result of my first attempt of this deck was a stall-out of epic proportions, absolutely sapping the table of any desire to continue playing. I don't always get it right, I will be the first to tell you that. And on this occasion, I had focused way too much on the headline, that I had just one creature. Out of fear of getting blown out by creature-heavy game states, I lent too heavily into control aspects, like removal, wipes, or counter magic, to have a deck that made for an interesting game at the casual level. And it sure as hell wasn't competitive either. So I knew that I was bound for a trip back to the drawing board to build a version that wouldn't get me kicked out of my LGS. But before I did, I wanted to take some time to reconsider what made for an actually interesting group hug deck, particularly now we're a year removed from Bumbleflower Summer. Now, between this, Dilemma.deck, and my Kenrith All Battles list, you could say that I am a fan of the archetype. I enjoy a deck that allows me, or in a lot of cases, requires me to play the table, rather than just always playing decks that really only seek to advance their own game plan. So let's say my opening thesis is this: Group Hug is the best archetype in Commander. So let's define Group Hug. If we consult the MTG wiki on this topic, we find the very short definition of
Group Hug is a deck archetype for multiplayer games. Often, Group Hug decks do not have a way to win on their own. Instead, the goal of the player piloting is to extend the game as long as possible by supporting whatever player is currently behind and moderating the effects each player can play and resolve.
I feel like this definition is lacking. Alternatively, we have, courtesy of the EDH wiki,
Group Hug is a commander deck archetype known for providing resources to opposing players, sometimes in exchange for political favours, for the purpose of using those resources or favours to eventually win the game. Unlike other deck archetypes, Group Hug's strategy is considered unique to the commander format.
Now this feels a bit closer to my own perception, but rather than chasing my tail trying to find a definition forever, in the spirit of the dialogue, I thought I'd consult an expert.
Hi, I am Cas Hinds, or Strixhaven Dropout. I do short form content on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and I'm also active on Blue Sky. I write articles for EDH Rec and Cool Stuff Inc. Under Cas Hinds.
And just how does Cas define Group Hug?
Group Hug is gaslighting. It's the ability to give out resources and kind of manipulate board states to your advantage. So everything that you give out, you must give yourself in doubly in return, or if you give it to someone, you have the intention of stealing it back.
So where other strategies may choose to attack players or their game pieces, Group Hug seeks to, in insidious fashion, attack the mind. But just what characteristics should we look for when thinking about our personal perfect hug commander?
One is color identity. I think that a lot of very popular group hug commanders, though I don't think effective group hug commanders, are usually in banned colors, right? I think that you need a little bit of black and you need a little bit of red as well in order to use the resources that you've given out to your advantage. You need what I like to call colors of punishment. If you just give out resources and you get nothing in return, Ban's really good at giving out resources and getting stuff back, but it doesn't have a good way of punishing other players for those resources. And I think that you need that color identity in the breakdown. So like Kenrith is a really good one. K&T is a really good one. I think I've even written an article why Bumbleflower is not a good one. I think it's better as a Voltron commander than a group hug commander. But the second thing that I think is really important is that you need to be able to give out resources readily. You need something built onto the commander that is enticing to other players, like card draw or mana. You need to give something readily every turn.
Now, Socrates doesn't perfectly fit this brief, but Cas still thinks there's something there.
I think it still works. I think it still works because giving people cards, they think that they can find the answer before they get milled out. But the thing about Socrates is that it prevents damage. So whatever it is you're trying to do, I'm going to stop one of it, and then I'm going to force you to draw. And it's an instant speed ability. You could wait until the very last minute to do it. You can do instant speed draw effects. And it's actually a very viable mill strategy if you can go all in on giving damage to other players, right? Making stuff big.
The challenge of building a group hug commander that effectively toes the lines that Cas identified is what makes the archetype so interesting. Finding the balance in both giving and taking is a challenge for any deck builder, and given the social aspect inherently present in the archetype, you have to be especially conscious of how your card choices will be received. Even before the deck hits the table, you have to have a degree of dialogue with yourself about the experience you're trying to create, and know how to effectively communicate that in pre-game conversation. Sure, some pods are going to be game for you ramping them for half the lands in their library, then windmill slamming Armageddon onto the table. Many are not.
But Group Hug Jellybean inherently relies on the actions of other players. Furthermore, it often depends on alternate win conditions, severely impacting its odds of actually winning. How then can it be called best?
Now, a lack of win conditions being present in hug decks is a common sentiment. Just refer back to that first definition of the archetype, but a misconception that Cas feels pretty strongly about.
This is a big thing. This makes me so mad. I'll keep it honest. I wrote that group hug article because I was sick of explaining this to people. I think that if you build a deck and your intention is not to win, regardless of the strategy of the deck, it leans more chaos deck than it does group hug. Group hug is a legitimate strategy for winning. It is a strategy intending to win. It's just hard for people to accept that giving out resources can be beneficial. And they think that it's king making. It's only king making if I lose. It's only king making if I lose. And you can say that about any other strategy. I think it's so important for people to realize that I play in some high powered pods. I play a lot of Magic. I spend a lot of time doing this. And my second highest win rate is with my group hug deck. My second highest win rate is because people can't say no to draw 5 cards. People can't say no to go and get every basic land out of your deck. People are not going to say no to that. But then I'll play something like, okay, go get 20 basic lands out of your deck. Okay, deal damage to each player equal to the amount of lands they control, right? I want, and this is a forced ability. I force you to get lands and I bolt you with it. Yeah, you put out a big board with all the mana I've given you. Okay, I'm gonna insurrect. I'm gonna steal the whole board and swing out. It's important that people understand that every time a group hug player, if they are a group hug player, gives out a resource, the intent is to steal it back in some way.
While the route to victory for a group hug deck may be less direct than that of those focused on combat or more traditional combo, it doesn't mean there isn't a plan, or more importantly, an intention to win. Alternative win cons are something that commonly feature in these decks, and accelerating them at the cost of giving resources to your opponents as well is a risk that the hug player usually enjoys taking. If your hug centers around card draw, pieces like Approach of the Second Sun, a sorcery for 6 and white that wins you the game the second time you cast it, and otherwise puts itself back into your library 7th from the top and nets you 7 life, or Jace, Wielder of Mysteries, a planeswalker for triple blue and 1 that has the static ability of having you win if you would draw from an empty library, are natural fits. If you're looking to gain a lot of life, Test of Endurance, an enchantment for white, and 2 that has you win on your upkeep if you have 50 or more life, or Aetherflux Reservoir, an artifact for 4 that has you gain 1 life for each spell you've cast that turn whenever you cast a spell, as well as allowing you to activate it for 50 life to deal 50 damage to any target, are both ways of converting this approach into a win, rather than just drawing the game out. Flipping the idea of the importance of winning, Commander is a social multiplayer format. In an ideal world, the win rate of any given deck should be in the region of 25%, as while the objective of the game is ultimately to win, it may be an indicator of an imbalance of the decks being played if one player or one deck is drastically overperforming from a win rate perspective. There are other factors to be considered on top of this, like the skill of players both in reference to piloting their own decks and how they influence the actions of others, as well as the ever-present influence of seating order on chances of victory. But for the most part, you want to see a fairly even distribution of wins in your playgroup, particularly if you've got a regular pod with a shared understanding of each other's deck building and play styles.
I think when we actually look at the numbers for Commander, it's a multiplayer format. Most people are playing in pods of 4. You should win about 25% of the time if the table is balanced, right? We're looking for balanced games. That's why the bracket system exists, right? We're looking for a balanced game. So honestly, should be winning 25% of the time. However, there is this weird bit where decks and players are different. You can have a very balanced power level deck and then an exceptional player. And I think that will also indicate how much someone wins. And it's hard to really place that in the bracket system because we just don't talk about people's play abilities. It's just not a good way to discuss that and quantify it. But honestly, I think that if you are an exceptional player and you're playing at the right power, you should try to shoot for about 30%. I think that means that you're a strong player and you're playing in the right power level. I think anything more than that means that you're playing a deck that's too strong or you're playing with people who barely know how to play. Like there's like a balance to these things. The thing is that the extra 5% just means that you're very good at getting creative, right? Sometimes you can have your back against the wall and you make a creative choice. I think that's the extra 5%. I think beyond that, there's something wrong if you're winning more than that.
Further diffusing the idea of winning being the only thing that matters is the social aspect of the format. Commander is arguably the MTG board game, and while there are definitely competitive elements of board games, just ask the vein in my forehead, there is a much greater emphasis on shared enjoyment and experience than that of, say, 60-card competitive Magic. In essence, literally winning a game of Commander is not the only thing that makes you a winner. Often it comes down to whether you actually enjoyed the frequently hour plus you committed to playing that game, and that is likely a result of the people you played with, how well your expectations of how a game would play out were met, and whether you actually had fun. Crazy, I know. By injecting additional resources into the equation through ramp, card draw, counters, or anything else, group hug decks often create situations where you get to play, see, and enjoy more of your deck. It contributes to those memorable game states that you look back on fondly because they are often so dialed up and extreme in comparison to the average game experience that they stand out. These are the experiences you get when you include a piece like Forced Fruition, an enchantment for blue, and 4 that has your opponents draw 7 cards every time they cast a spell. On one hand, this is a game piece that makes players churn through their decks at an incredible pace and can easily lead to deck outs, but it is the most fun way possible of doing this, given it allows, at least for a turn if they don't control an effect like Reliquary Tower or Thought Vessel, the players on the receiving end access to those cards, as opposed to an effect like Memory Erosion that disproportionately affects those without ready access to their graveyard. Mill is an entire other topic. Now, this effect in particular feels like it could belong more in the realms of chaos decks in isolation due to the outrageous situations it creates, but when nestled within a hug deck that utilizes other sources of mill as a means of victory, it creates a much stronger game plan than you would see in the chaos archetype. This is why in my list for Socrates, it's a fun piece that still works conducively with other effects like Folio of Fancies, an artifact for blue and 1 that removes maximum hand size for all players, can have each player draw X cards for XX and tapping, and can mill each opponent for a number of cards equal to the cards in their hand for 2, a blue, and tapping. This shows one way hug players should build around the beneficial effects in their decks. While providing advantage to other players, there should also be ways this advantage can be utilized against them, and ultimately lead to a potential win. This is a fine line to walk, however, as leaning too heavily into the punishment will inevitably take you more into group slug territory, and at that point you might as well be pinging everyone with Valgaloth. There is admittedly a fuzziness in the distinction between hug and slug, and often both of these archetypes can end up cribbing strategies from each other in order to achieve a win. Otherwise, in the case of symmetrical benefit, hug players should seek to find a way to break parity on that effect in some way. This is a trait that the archetype shares with another much maligned strategy, stacks. A good stacks player, and particularly one that doesn't just seek to torture players at the table for the sake of it, must have ways of breaking parity to create advantage out of the effects they run and ultimately win the game. Otherwise, they're just preventing others from taking game actions, and that's not very fun. In this way, Hug is almost Stacks' friendlier cousin, but rather than preventing actions, it accelerates them and seeks to make a win over the top rather than from underneath. Stacks players are typically the enemy at the table and rely on mechanical protections to survive until they can win, whereas Hug often makes friends and often allows players to leverage social protections to stay in the game. There's typically at least one player that enjoys that little boost and will do their best to keep you around. It can also help if you have even a modicum of charisma. So from here, we could maybe look to amend our initial statement to something more like, Group Hug is the most fun archetype in Commander.
But we must consider, Group Hug often takes away agency from other players, as well as reducing the efficacy of their own deck construction. Can this truly be the most fun?
I'm pretty sure that one of the biggest gripes I hear with Group Hug decks is that it essentially removes the factor of other players' own deck construction, or prevents them from diagnosing where issues might arise, by providing additional resources like ramp or card draw that effectively sand the edges off of their own deck lists. I can understand this problem. There's nothing worse than getting all excited to play a new deck you've built, shuffling up, and finishing a full game feeling like you haven't actually gotten to play it. That might be because it bricked or flooded, which might prompt some evaluation of the deck's construction, but if you've spent a whole game being bankrolled by Glunch, it's a bit harder to tell where the issues may lie, though all those lands you cut might be one of them. The natural response to this issue would be to incorporate an element of choice into any of the Hug elements included in your deck, allowing for players who do not wish to have access to the additional resources that you are likely providing to simply not take them. However, I personally have not played with many, if any, players that will turn down card draw, treasures, or other benefits if offered. To refer back to my dilemma video, we are rarely dealing with totally rational operators in a game of Commander. Socrates is a great example of where a player has the choice whether or not to engage with the Hug effect, as it requires players to attack you for you to gain benefit off of it. This goes even further, as you can additionally provide players card draw with Socrates at no gain to yourself if you decide to target a creature that is not attacking you, and give card draw to 2 other players in order to curry favor at the table. This aligns quite nicely with the philosophy for Hug that Spice outlined in its video as well, where you can choose which players to provide benefits in addition to yourself, so as not to just equitably accelerate the entire table to the point that the additional resources present are essentially moot, and that the player with the best deck just wins anyway. Simply put, you don't have to give the card draw away to the strongest player at the table, but you may choose to if it prevents a significant amount of damage or gives yourself the greatest benefit. Otherwise, you might use the draw to incentivize players with weaker board states to send their threats and removal elsewhere. The element of choice is also a potential hole in Socrates' efficacy as a deck that plays to win, so how do we solve that issue? Well, in the most extreme example, you can play the most counterintuitive public enemy in the world. An aura for blue and 2 that enchants a creature, has us draw a card when the creature dies, and most importantly, has all creatures attack that creature's controller each combat if able. This is a statement that you have absolutely no fear whatsoever, and is probably best reserved for when you have ways of untapping Socrates multiple times a turn cycle, with any or all of Freed from the Real, Pemin's Aura, or Sting the Glinting Dagger. Brave? Stupid? Both? Whatever you call it, it is goddamn memorable. A less extreme version is presenting any of our win cons we got into before. People, particularly playing creature-focused decks, tend to attack you when you've cast Approach for the first time, but this is exactly what we want. To quote Maslow, or perhaps someone else according to Wikipedia and as a result AI,
it is tempting if the only tool you have is a hammer, to treat everything as if it were a nail.
What the element of choice doesn't solve, unless the table creates a united front and refuses to take any benefit at all from the Hugger, is the disproportionate impact that Group Hug has on certain other archetypes. Aggro is a strategy that struggles enough as it is in Commander, given the absolutely gargantuan health pools it has to tackle, but the presence of Hug at the table makes it even harder. Aggro decks rely on the longer setup times of other strategies in order to establish a board state state of cheap threats and start dealing damage before opponents have the resources to deal with them, typically creating a window in which they have to make an impact in order to be relevant at the game at large. This key window is shrunk by Hug, as slower strategies which are more likely to take resources given a choice are accelerated, whether that be through ramp, card draw, or even token creatures that can reduce the aggro strategy's efficacy by preventing attackers being able to actually get in for damage early. Socrates is especially bad news for aggro given he prevents damage altogether. Add that to the fact that he'll be up and able to activate his ability turn 3 or turn 4 typically, and that window just isn't really there. Moreover, when faced with this problem, an aggro player would likely feed into the Soc player's strategy by choosing to turn their early game threats into card draw when offered the dialogue ability, an attempt to make the best of a bad situation and dig for more answers, despite the fact that they're giving away card draw, which may ultimately weaken their position further. As they transition into the late game, aggro deck's efficiency tends to hinge on how much life has been lost already, often converting sub-20 life totals into wins with indirect damage effects like token creation with an impact tremors or war leader's call, or targeting a big creature that could otherwise be chumped with a Chandra's ignition to get in. Soc's presence tends to lead to players maintaining 30 plus life well past turn 5, so these approaches just don't have the same impact, which may be additionally flavorful if you take Xenophon's depictions of Socrates as dull at face value. Practically, this comes down to the same consideration you should exercise with any deck. Is it complementary to the rest of the pod, or am I just going to end up neutralizing other strategies completely in a way that makes the game unfun for others? It could also be argued that group hug strategies further warp the game of Commander through creating additional difficulty in threat assessment, and as a result, policing the leader. Part of the balance that exists in Commander as a format, as well as multiplayer free-for-all style games in general, is that if a player has a significant advantage, the other players at the table can and should make deals and form temporary alliances in order to mitigate this. However, the ability to do this is directly proportional to how interactive players have designed their decks to be, one to consider. Part of what makes this difficult with Group Hug is that due to the acceleration of resources, the margin for error in dealing with a player and the window in which their deck is still assembling a winning board state is reduced. In addition to this, when trying to assess the strength of the Hug player themselves, win conditions are often not as telegraphed or immediately obvious as they are with combat-based strategies, or even arguably combos, where as part of pre-game discussions at the casual level, players often disclose the presence of combos in their deck, as well as the key pieces required to pull them off.
What I have always done is I am not the kind of person who gaslights without telling you've been gaslighted. I have oftentimes, whenever I'm in a combo situation where I am playing my group hug shenanigans and I feel like I'm gonna lose, and I was like, oh, well, I don't actually have it, and people start to grumble. This is what they do to group hug players a lot of times, like, why did you give him all these resources? Now he's out of control. I will be like, okay, so when we die, I will explain to you what I was up to. And I've done this. I've literally said, I didn't draw my final land and you killed KNT before I could force a draw, force a land. I had insurrection in hand. So that was going to be my win condition. I would have won if I had it. A lot of times I show people...
Group Hug isn't expected to inherently exercise the same degree of transparency as combo decks, but that doesn't mean that you as a player of the archetype shouldn't be honest about your route to victory. I'm not saying that you should be showing everyone your hand all the time and opening yourself up to being counterplayed, but you are likely to find your larger grifts are a bit more successful if you otherwise are viewed as a player with a degree of integrity. With all of this considered, maybe we take one last swing at our statement on Group Hug. Group Hug, by virtue of being a social archetype, is the most flexible across different levels of casual gameplay. The efficacy of Hug in actually winning games is largely determined by the table's willingness to engage with it. But if we discard the idea of winning being the most important thing in a game of casual Commander, and instead determine the winners of a game to be anyone who actually enjoyed it, then suddenly the outlook for the success rate of a hug deck increases drastically. If we as a hug player are able to effectively diagnose the sorts of pods that are likely to find the extra juice that the archetype introduces to the game enjoyable, rather than feeling that it detracts from the type of game they want to play, then we're likely to be creating more winners by this definition besides ourselves as well.
And speaking of spreading joy, I recently took this deck to Axion Now's Command First UK, and, well, the results speak for themselves.
Hi, yeah, so, long time listener, first time caller. Socrates, huh? What a guy. Just kept yapping and yapping. Essentially, it felt like the actually of game pieces, and definitely still enchanted by it in a way. I guess that was how Socrates was way back when. And he just managed to talk down a really, really angry mole, and that mole is now questioning his life. So, thanks for that.
I had a nightmare last night. I was caught in this giant spider web as a massive spider approached me, bearing on down. But then I noticed it had Socrates' head, and I just struggled to break free as it started yapping at me relentlessly. I think that accurately describes the experience of playing against this deck. No matter what you do, there seems to be an answer for it. So yeah, I'm fairly certain that I will never play against it again.
Honestly, every waking thought now is trying to work out what the Socrates deck is doing. It was a rough experience. It was confusing, bewildering. I was bewitched by it, but I was also bothered by it. I'm bothered by you, the fact that you created it. That mind of yours, you should be studied by scientists. Okay, hope you well, bye.
Winners all. A lot of decks and archetypes have good days and bad days, but are likely to be fairly static from a bracket perspective. A high 3 may be able to hang with the 4s, but its strategy is likely largely determined by the internal metagame of what a 3 actually is, as well as its creator's intentions. It's also likely to roll most genuine bracket 2s in a pretty obvious way. A group hug deck, however, depending on what effects it's running, can actually elevate the efficacy of the decks around it. And while it may not bring a 2 to the level of a 3, it can help flatten the peaks and troughs of a slightly mismatched pod at the hug pilot's discretion. What it does ask, however, is a reasonable level of game knowledge from all the players involved. The hug player themselves needs to know how to identify the strengths of the decks around them to prevent themselves from just handing the win to another player with the resources they provide, and likewise the other players at the table must know when to stop taking deals with the hug players to prevent them from just winning outright.
In terms of power, I think group hug actually is very strong. I don't think it's like a bracket 4 kind of strength. I usually put group hug decks around 3s because they require a lot of setup and they require a lot of complicity. Like people need to like agree to certain things for it to actually do the thing. And if you get denied that, it usually blows you out pretty hard. So it's hard to just say that it's effective enough to do stuff on its own. It basically durdles if it doesn't get the value that it needs through other players. So if players deny that, then it loses its spice, and it can't guarantee spice on its own. Not to sound like pretentious in a way, but I think also group hug is the kind of thing you can't just pick up. You can't just be like, I've played very little Magic and I pick up a group hug deck and I can do the gaslighting very effectively. It's like you have to like get very comfortable with how other people play Magic in order to effectively use your cards. Like for example, Tempting Worm is 1 and a green, it's 2 mana and it allows people to put stuff on board. You could cast that turn 2, but that's not a good idea. You don't have enough mana at that point to counter anything. You don't have enough mana to steal anything. You don't have any mana to protect yourself, right? It's not a good idea to play it on turn 2. But if you are late in the game and everyone's building up and you have tons of mana at your disposal to like insurrect or XYZ, definitely play the Tempting Worm later. I would love to play a Tempting Worm into an insurrection. Put everything you want on board and then I get to steal it, right? It's not the kind of thing that you just I'm just going to give out resources willy-nilly. You still have to be strategic.
Managing the risk of providing resources to other players, as well as how and when, is part of the complexity of playing the archetype, and in a lot of cases, again, what makes it so interesting. Also, dealing with how that makes you look to the other players in your pod makes it even more of a challenge. That's not to say that group hug players need to be deeply strict and regimented with the way they play their decks, just that there's potentially an extra layer of consideration required in how the archetype meshes with the pre-existing social element present in Commander. Any more comments, Sock? Good. When considering the application of the Socratic dialogue and method for broadening our understanding, I started doing some blue sky thinking about the potential merit of a system that, rather than offering you immediate answers to questions already influenced by your existing biases, instead retorts with its own questions to make you assess why you asked the question in the first place, and hopefully grows your understanding in some indirect way. Anyway, AI bad. Swiftly bringing it back to Magic, tools within the deck building process often offer you this shortcut without consideration for your intentions, existing understanding, and where that could ultimately be taken. When you search up a commander on EDHREC, for example, you put simply get a list of suggestions based on data sourced from others' deck building for what cards you could play in your deck. There are tools for filtering based on what may influence your intentions, whether that's existing archetypes, budget restrictions, or most recently, number of game changes and intended bracket, but this reduces all the nuance in deck building to somewhat reductive numerical qualities, which could be seen to contribute in some way to the issue of bracket angling.
Another writer, Levi Perry, he told me about this term called bracket angling. And I've told people, like, if you are trying to hit a bracket, you misunderstand the brackets. It is to explain what your deck is, not what to build your deck around. If you are building around a bracket, I guarantee you it punches above that class. Whatever it is you're trying to do, it punches above it because it's an intentionality to create power in an enclosed situation. And with the amount of cards that we have in Magic, there's just no way that you've done that and it's not an effective use of those cards, which pushes it above the bracket that it would stand at.
The addition of game changers, particularly, a tool to give a degree of objectivity to pre-game discussion while informing other players of your deck building intentions, is interesting in this context. It essentially becomes a shorthand for a shorthand when nestled within a data-driven system like this. And rather than being a reference point for a deck's strength, as well as the type of game it creates and the discussion that could take place around it, it is instead treated here as an absolute. The lack of intention one can communicate to a system like this is epitomized in that when I visit the EDHREC page on Moxfield for my Socrates deck list, it really wants to recommend me creatures. And I hear you, how's it supposed to know what I want to do without me telling it that that's what I'm doing? Well, I would if there was a button for it. In all seriousness, some filters for this page would be a great help, please. And thank you, Moxfield. I love the rest of the website. It's fantastic. Not sponsored. Cheers. Bye. Now, I don't think EDHREC is a bad thing. I think it's a very useful and often interesting tool for the aggregation of data around our format, as well as otherwise being a great platform for writers in the space to explain their intentions around deck building, how data can inform this, and how these tools can be used to guide the reader's own approach. I enjoy reading many of the deck texts and articles here, as well as listening to the podcast for this reason, as the more long-form write-ups and discussion allow for much more of the ever-important nuance in the deck building process to be highlighted. And to clarify, I don't think every Commander deck necessitates an essay to justify its existence, but the process of interrogating a deck's construction is something that I personally enjoy. I always seek to have a deep connection with the decks that I create, and particularly that I choose to showcase on this channel in whatever way. In the spirit of dialogue, the more I have to say about a deck in the first place, the more the people I play with and you, the viewer, have the opportunity to actually respond to. Hint, hint. This level of consideration is something that's become harder to maintain with the accelerated release cycle of sets in recent years. With archetypes receiving new support pieces and potential commanders literally all the time, we as players are essentially being begged at all times to scrap entire decks, or at least cut cards for better pieces that are constantly becoming available. It is quite simply harder than ever to feel attached to what should be incredibly personal creations. When a new set throws 5 different commander-eligible cards at you that you might want to build, and the next set with all of its potential goodies is just around the corner, or likely already being spoiled, it's incredibly difficult to take the time and consider every moving piece of the decks that you're building, particularly if you're creating content around them and have to get things finished to increasingly tight deadlines. Couldn't be me. I think there's huge value in thoroughly analyzing the ideas and play patterns, as well as the ever hard to quantify vibe that I'm attempting to create whenever I put a new list together. And while I don't think that this is the hug deck to end all hug decks, or that it's especially going to change the mind of anyone who doesn't like the archetype already, I hope that applying for the considerations that both myself and especially others have for the potential pitfalls of this style of gameplay, I ultimately create something more valuable and interesting. I try to view every deck as a statement, and whether it's powerful, janky, or anywhere in between, that statement should at least be interesting. After all, if competitive Magic is a debate, casual should be viewed as an exchange of ideas. And I think that's something we can all agree on.
Socrates and the Jelly Bean is filmed in front of a live studio audience.
Thank you, as always, for watching. I'm sorry that this took so long to get around to. I moved house and had to figure out my studio. I'm switching software for financial reasons. And this script took a lot of thinking and mentally wrangling and getting my head around. So thank you for your patience. Also, a massive thank you to Cas for taking the time to speak to me for this video, and keep an eye out for the full interview on this channel if you'd like to hear everything we got to talking about.
Yes, I am Strixhaven Dropout, or Cas Hinds. I write articles for EDH, Rec, and Cool Stuff Inc. I actually had an article that we kind of briefly talked about come out a couple days ago about is winning the most important thing in Commander. I have some other article. I have an interesting article coming up that I would recommend people read about the faults in CEDH and why it struggles to be a competitive format, and a new format that attempts to correct the mistakes in that format, called Coliseum. So yeah, look out for that. It's very, very fun. And something I'd like to plug is that if you're going to be at MagicCon Atlanta, I will be there as a creator. So I'm very, very excited to see everyone, and yeah, come ask me about magic stuff.
I've included a link in the description if you'd like to see the full list for my creatureless, tokenless Socrates list, and if you'd like to see in action, I played the deck with the Magic Castles over on their channel, which is also linked below. Beyond that, if you give me a +1/+1 and like and subscribe, I'll untap at the beginning of each combat. See you later.
Ian, I don't want to be rude or anything, but if I ever have to play against that deck again, I will break into your house and I will cut up your wigs. If you have wigs, I'll find something. I just can't. No, I can't. Ian, I can't sleep. I can't stop thinking about your deck. It's so confusing, and I'm not sure how to interact with it at all. Every time I try to do something, your deck did something strange, and it felt like I was falling down a mine shaft of confusion. If you ever get that deck out again, I don't think I can play with you. I just won't. Have you considered industrial strength therapy? Or just seeing someone about the series of choices and experiences in your life that led to building that Socrates deck? That Socrates deck is kind of like the gathering deck version of The Ring, the videotape. Like 7 days later, I am considering giving up magic and going to live in the wilderness amongst the trees. Horrible experience. Okay, hope you're well, bye!